Well, I'd like to give you all a warm welcome to the introductory lecture for the free course, Paradise Lost in Slow Motion. I really wish we could all be sitting in the same room over some tea, maybe some snacks, maybe with some candles and be reading this poem together. But it's so nice to at least be live online. I'm joined here with my students from the Antrim Literature Project, which is an online public humanities platform that aims to make the study of literature accessible to readers beyond the paywalls of the university. So welcome to you all, and I'm looking forward to our discussion after the recorded lecture. And I'd also like to thank my co-founders and administrators at the Antrim Literature Project for helping me get this course going and to make it a reality. And you all can find these recorded lectures at our database at antrimliteratureproject.org. So this is lecture 0. And in this lecture, I want to tell you how to read Paradise Lost. Some of you have never read this poem before. Some of you have, but many of you have not. And I want to give you some tips for reading this for your first time. And then I want to turn to the epic invocation. After a few remarks, we'll be looking at the first 26 lines of Book 1. And along the way, we'll learn something of Milton's life and times and what the poet is trying to accomplish in this poem, why he wrote it. And I also generally want to put the new readers at ease because this is a big poem and it is a difficult poem. And importantly, as for the focus of this group, it is a poem. We must read it as a poem, as an object of verbal art that must be experienced by the senses, by seeing, and through a surrender of our attention and imagination, but perhaps most importantly, through hearing. And so I hope that in your own private readings, you'll be reading some passages aloud, or at least listening for the sounds in your head, just to get a sense of that, because it's all about hearing its music and its audible power. It's not like reading a novel. And that's one of the things we'll be learning, I hope, in this course. So Paradise Lost is one of the most enduringly beautiful poems in the English language. And I think that owning a copy of Paradise Lost is kind of like living on the borders of a beautiful garden, a garden that's full of vibrant shrubs, laden fruit trees, native herbs and flowers, and a few exotic specimens even. A garden with winding paths that please and entice, with hidden nooks and bowers and fragrant airs that breathe the promise of discovery. It's a garden of that particularly English kind of looking. It's that English art of looking overgrown and wild, but truly being carefully pruned and cultivated. To see everything in this garden, it would take years, maybe even lifetimes, actually. And for this reason, a lot of people just abide at the gates of the garden. They're waiting for the right moment when to enter and to devote generous time and attention. They don't want to enter yet, but they want to eventually. Others study maps of the garden and they talk with those who have been in the garden, but they haven't been themselves. Some, or rather others, enter into the garden and then quickly retreat, perhaps overwhelmed by the beauty and extravagance, the vocabulary of Paradise Lost. And maybe even with their own sense of inadequacy. I think that comes from a place of humility. And they think, well, once I've studied the Latin names of these flowers and I can identify some herbs, then I'll go into the garden when I can fully appreciate it. But those who enter and pass through, bringing a heart that watches and receives, as Wordsworth says, bringing ignorance and knowledge, whether they are amateurs or master gardeners, whether they are standers, strollers, or streakers through the garden. Anyone who makes it through this garden are changed. Anyone who does that is changed. Now, it is the nature of experience not least of all literary experience, reading experience, to change one's consciousness and to alter one's posture and place and way of relating in the world. Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic Greek, said, he's got that famous passage, I never enter the same river twice, because it's never the same river and I'm never the same person. And entering into Paradise Lost is kind of like that. It grows with you. And so I don't think that you should linger on the margins any longer if you have. And I'd like to commend you for starting this journey. It's a big task. It's a big book, even for native English speakers. And for some of you, English is your second language or third. But I believe that no matter who you are or where you are, this poem has something for you. I want to talk a little bit about the objectives of this course, what I hope you'll get from it. As a student, it's my hope that you'll develop a confidence in reading Paradise Lost. It's a massive undertaking, and it's easy to do in community. We have this reading group, and I think that's going to go a long way. I also want to give you confidence for reading other works of poetry that are big like this, or that are out of our time frame, and with language that might be a little archaic, or complex. I think you'll learn some of the major genres of poetry as we go, but especially you'll learn how to read poetry as poetry, and how it's different from prose. I hope that it'll also help you discover a little bit about yourself, a bit about your own literary tastes, what you like, what you don't like. You know, Paradise Lost is a garden full of many things, and Barbara Lewowski, a great Miltonist, she says it's encyclopedic. We'll talk a little bit about that. It contains a little bit of everything, and so it's hard to pass through without liking something. And then finally, I hope it will enhance your recognition for seeing beauty and hearing beauty in language. This is a goal that is very important to the Antrim Literature Project. We want to help folks see beauty in language and meaning in language through close reading and conversation and community. And that's what we'll be doing in this course. So I've called this course Paradise Lost in Slow Motion. And as I've explained elsewhere, reading in slow motion means, among other things, savoring language. It means pressing forward, and it will mean pressing forward through the poem at a slow and steady pace. It sometimes will require you to endure parts that you find boring. And there are parts for me that I meet with disinterest, but don't let your boredom discourage you. There's so much in this poem that will interest you. Not every plant in the garden will please you, but Paradise Lost is an epic poem. Now, on my YouTube channel, some of you found me there. Some of you have been longtime attendees or attenders of the Antrim Literature Project events. And you're familiar with lyric poetry. It's mostly what I study on the channel. Aristotle's three kinds of poetry still hold true today. There's the lyric poem, which is the brief, personal, musical in nature. Then there's the dramatic poem, like Shakespeare's verse. It's meant to be performed and driven by plot and character, organized into verse. And then there's the epic poem, a long narrative poem on some grand or heroic subject that tells the story of some character or group of characters. Epics are often encyclopedic, meaning they contain almost everything. It's certainly true for Paradise Lost. There are all kinds of modes of speaking in Paradise Lost. There's political oratory, judicial oration, there's parliamentary debate. There are scientific and philosophic passages, including treatises on human nature, the elements and creation of astronomy. There's history, including human and political history, but also biblical and redemptive histories. Its genres contain legal discourse, prophecy, hymns, evening and morning hymns, sermons even, allegory, as we'll see in Book 2, and epistolary writing. Everything that a 17th century person would be interested in literarily, Paradise Lost has it all. And it's also something that will just appeal to anyone in any time period. So it's not surprising then that disinterest may be a part of your experience. So may ignorance. So let me give you some tips on how to read this book. You'll not need to read the footnotes on everything you do not understand. I do not want you to feel obligated to do so. In fact, such a sense of obligation may be detrimental to your experience of the poem. Expertise can help. Footnotes can help. But stopping each time you come across an unknown word may break the enchantment of the poem. There will be time to come back to the poem and learn more. In the syllabus, I sent a link to Dartmouth's John Milton's reading room. Great version, has discrete notations, but they do have the notes of any kind will disrupt the attention and sometimes cause disenchantment. And Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century critic, gave some excellent advice to lay readers, public readers, for reading Shakespeare the first time. And let me get that up for us here. And I think that this advice is true for Paradise Lost. He says, notes are often necessary, but they are necessary evils. Let him that is yet unacquainted with the powers of Shakespeare, and who desires to feel the highest pleasure that drama can give, read every play from the first scene to the last, with utter negligence of all his commentators. When his fancy is once on the wing, let it not stoop at correction or explanation. When his attention is strongly engaged, let it disdain alike to turn aside to the name of Theobald or Pope. Let him read on through brightness and obscurity, through integrity and corruption. Let him preserve his comprehension of the dialogue and his interest in the fable. When the pleasures of novelty have ceased, let him attempt exactness and read the commentators. But only then. This, I think, is good advice for a first-time reader of Paradise Lost. Maybe even a second-time reader. You want this imaginative engagement. You want to surrender to it. And sometimes notes help, and sometimes they don't. That's just something to be aware of and something that you should use at your own discretion. You might like the notes. Another bit by Charles Osgood. This has to do with the allusions. There are many allusions in Paradise Lost, as I'm sure you've noticed in the 86 lines we read for this week. Here's what Charles Osgood said. And this is from his book, Poetry as a Means of Grace, which was published in 1941. I think this is excellent. And he's talking about first-time readers for Milton, and this is his advice. I find it a present habit of students, superinduced, I think, by a generation of teachers too far gone in bibliographomania. That is, I think, the obsession to read all the critics and the notes, to scant their scrutiny of an author's works and run off in search of something about them. Beware of the habit. Your legs will never get strong enough to carry you if you never walk without a crutch. You may have all of Milton's poetry in one well-printed volume for a little more than $1. Let inclination and curiosity be your guides. Mark favorite passages. Get them by heart. You are embarked on a romantic voyage of discovery. Enjoy the music and the spectacle and ponder the meaning. You will discover by yourself, what you discover by yourself is worth over and over what any authority can tell you. And if you look long and singly and humanly enough at the poem itself, probably you can tell the authority something. If the allusions and so learned a poet as Milton should trouble your classroom conscience, lay it asleep by enjoying the iridescent luster which their romantic remoteness lends to the texture of the poetry. I love that the iridescent luster of allusions that you don't understand lends it this romantic remoteness. So, ignorance will be your friend here. You may not want to remain in ignorance, but do not be discouraged and actually let it be your guide. Let knowledge be your guide or rather, let ignorance be your guide where knowledge might lead you astray from the experience. I think that's totally fine. And it has nothing to do against editions with notes. It has nothing to do with people who teach it in context with criticism. I think there's value to that. But for you, if you're reading this for the first time, I hope this puts you at ease. Now, enough about the poem. Let's experience it through some reading. So I'm going to read the entire invocation, the 26 lines. On my video on YouTube, the advertisement for this course, I did closely read the first 5 lines, but I want to take it all in at large here. Slow reading is not always close reading. And I want to talk about what Milton is trying to do. The invocation contains 2 complete sentences. The first one is of 16 lines. I'm going to read them both. In fact, I'm going to read them from the slide. And I want you to just listen. Don't follow too much along, but hear it. Of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us, and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb, or of Sinai, didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. Or if Sion hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first wast present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like satst brooding on the vast abyss, and madest it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support, that to the heights of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. I just want to go back to this line here. And I'm moving my zoom bar out of the way so I can read here. The passage, as I said, contains 2 sentences, and each of which disclose an important purpose. First purpose here: to pursue things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. I find it interesting that he loads the sentence in a periodic style in which his thesis or his purpose is at the end of each sentence. Good sentences, they ease in, they begin with familiar information, and they end with something new or introduce a new idea. They begin with the general and end with the particular. Samuel Johnson's essays, sentences often have that structure. Here, as I said in my advertisement, the syntax is often changed. The main verb is here. He's telling the heavenly muse to sing. You have that spondee, the sing heavenly muse. So he's calling on the muse. It's something that epic poets do. Most epic poems begin this way, with some sort of invocation. But he wants to make a contribution to literary history. He wants his adventurous song to pursue things unattempted in prose or rhyme. Now that's a bold claim. And let's see the face of the one who makes this claim. Here's John Milton, age 62 in 1670. This was when he was working on the 12th book, Paradise Lost. The 10th book was published at this point in 1667, excuse me. And he did do much for English literature. There he is with his open yet unseeing eyes, looking out from the frontage page here of this engraving. Milton is a part of what Harold Bloom calls the visionary left wing of the Protestant movement. And I love that whole idea of that tradition, the visionary left wing of the Protestant movement. The chief poet of this movement at this time would have been Spenser, whose The Faerie Queene was published in 1596. 1596. John Milton's Paradise Lost published 1667, so almost 100 years after Spenser's The Faerie Queene was published. Where does William Shakespeare fall upon the timeline of English literature? Well, Shakespeare died in 1616. He was writing sonnets in the 1590s along with other poems, and some of his later works were published up until his death during the reign of King James I of England. Now, Shakespeare died in 1660. The decades that followed were tumultuous for England. Many things happened. When Milton was a teenager, the son of King James I, Charles I, came to power. And King Charles I set about renovating the English church. Many Protestants felt that Charles I was reversing the Reformation by reverting the English church back to Roman Catholicism, and that his government did not represent the concerns of the people. This eventually led to a civil war, two civil wars, between the king and those who wanted religious liberty and parliamentary representation as well. Milton was a major champion of this cause, the Republican cause, against the monarchy. And when Charles I was defeated by the Republicans and executed, there followed in England an 11-year Republican rule in which England was governed without a king. It was a cause that Milton believed in deeply, and he gave his intellect and his writing to the Republican government, writing treatises on religious topics, on freedom of the press. He's very much concerned with liberty of many kinds. Eventually, this parliamentary government broke apart, and the son of King Charles I, who was in exile, was invited back to the throne. And in 1660, Charles II, Charles I's son, came back to England, and the monarchy was restored. Now, by this time, Milton had gone blind. And when Charles II returned and the monarchy was restored, people who supported the execution of the king were persecuted. Some of them were actually brutally executed. Milton was thrown in prison as a blind man because he did support Charles I's execution. He supported the Republican government. And he was almost executed, Milton was. But the story goes that the poet Andrew Marvell actually persuaded the council to spare him, arguing that God had punished Milton with blindness enough so that no execution was needed. This was punishment enough. A type of argument that I think really probably doesn't work any later than the 17th century. The idea that God punished Milton for his blindness. So as a Republican, Milton was harassed, his two wives dead, nearly lost his life And it was under these conditions that Milton began writing what would be his chief contribution to English poetry. The first edition of Paradise Lost was published in 10 books in 1667, and the 12-book Paradise Lost that we all know today was published in 1674. It put forward this meditative tradition that began with Spenser, but it also gave England something new, something that the English language had never had before. What Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey were to the Greeks, what Virgil's Aeneid was to the Romans, Paradise Lost was for England, is for England, and the English language. He showed the world just how high poetry could fly upon the wings of the English language. He gave the meditative poets of the 18th century that followed him, poets like James Beattie, Thomas Gray, he gave them a mode for private and majestic musings. He gave the Romantic poets, such as Wordsworth and Coleridge, inspiration for their own imaginative poetry. And when many poets and critics were looking to Greece and Rome for examples of the best poetry, the Romantics and many others looked to Milton and Spenser and Shakespeare as a literary trinity of the English tradition, the meditative tradition. This is the native poetry for them. So he wants to give England a literary contribution. Second thing he desires is to assert eternal providence and to justify the ways of God to men. Justify meaning to explain, but also it carries a religious connotation. Many of the Puritans and many of the English Protestants and English evangelicals and American evangelicals, their grandchildren, associate knowledge of God as sometimes a prerequisite for salvation of God. So understanding of the gospel is in some ways a prerequisite among some traditions of Protestantism. It's certainly not true for all traditions of Protestantism, but this idea of justification and explanation, of knowledge and of declaration are bound up together. And so in a way, there's this redemptive goal for Paradise Lost, but it also is just explanation, a new way of looking at it. The Russian formalists had a term for this in the 20th century called defamiliarization. Poetry has the power to defamiliarize, to cast something that we see so often and that has become old, to pick it up, to blow the dust off it and turn it in a new light, and to make it unfamiliar in a way. So, okay, this meant for Milton's readers, he wanted to locate the human condition, the loss of something that we all feel. He wanted to locate that into a larger history and to point us to some hope. For Milton, this was the story of redemption told in the Bible, and its hope was the death, resurrection, and eventual return of Christ, the Son incarnate, who was the second Adam. And that's how his original readers were reading this. Where does this leave the majority of readers in the 21st century who are not Christian? Are they necessarily excluded in participating in this rediscovery? Not at all. Many unorthodox and secular poets and readers have discovered in this story and the stories of the Bible representations of real human conditions. We have to have a story. We must locate ourselves within some myth. And that's what's interesting about this book. We have to do that consciously, or else the world and society will locate us in one of their own. And that's partly what this book offers, a way of contextualizing human loss, human grief, human hope within a broader history, past, present, and future. The universal holds true in spite of the religious particulars. And that's not to say that Christians can't have the same experience as well, but it certainly doesn't bar any secular readers or unchristian readers who are religious in different traditions to enjoy this poem. And the story can provide us with a model for understanding our own loss. The last thing I want to say before we turn off the recording and go to discussion is I just want to bring our attention to the allusions. I talked a little bit about allusions when reading Charles Osgood. We have this secret top of Oreb, or of Sinai, the heavenly muse, perhaps the Holy Spirit, perhaps the Spirit of God. Just to point this out, again, the iridescent luster. If you don't know what these mean, it's okay. If you do, you are rewarded. Christopher Ricks has a book on illusion in which he says, a plagiarist hopes that you do not recognize what they stole, but a poet hopes you recognize the illusion. The illusion is not required of the reader to see, but the reader is rewarded for having recognized it. So here's a little example of how this works, and it's never quite determined, and I'll show you how. So Mount Oreb and Sinai, both, they're sometimes interchangeably referred to in the Old Testament as the mount where God visited Moses and gave him the Ten Commandments. Oreb is one of the dry mountains at the top, sometimes associated with the sun, but within the Sinai region and the Sinai Mountains. Siloa is interesting. Or if Sion hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God. Sion hill, another hill, a different hill, Siloa's brook. So some say that this Siloa brook, well, it is mentioned in Isaiah, was built by King Ahaz to water the city. But there's also something going on here with Siloa's brook, right here at line 11. It sounds very similar to another name in the Gospel of John, John chapter 9. And this is how sometimes there are two allusions in one, and you never know which one is actually in operation within the imagination. John chapter 9. Jesus finds a blind man. He spits upon the ground, makes mud out of the ground, and rubs it upon the eyes of the blind man. And he tells the blind man to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And the blind man does, and he's made to see. This is an interesting context. And I'll just read the passage from John chapter 9, verse 1, which is very interesting to Milton's own blindness. It's always helpful to have a King James version handy when reading Milton. This is John chapter 9, verse 1. And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. His blindness is not blamed, it's not a punishment, but it's so that the works of God may be made manifest in him. And I think that there's this stereoscopic valence with this word Siloa, where he's saying, and it ties in with the prayer, Milton's own blindness and what people were saying in the courts about Milton, saying that he was blind from punishment of God. It's a subtle vindication, I think. Ties in with the prayer, where he says here, 22, what in me is dark, illumine. You see, light has an important role to play in this poem. It's something that comes up a lot to Milton, and it's something that I think is there. So that's an example of how the allusions sometimes work. They're sometimes built upon each other. They sometimes move, but they are not required that you understand it. That was just a little extra there towards the book. So next week's lecture will be on book 1, the entire book. So read all of book 1. We're now going to move into discussion and conversation with the class. So for everyone on YouTube watching the recording, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video next week.